bear with me because I just drove 4 hours to watch an hour and a half of mind-blowing stuff, and then drove 4 hours back to finally get back to my chair and bring you this report. Lots of good stuff came out in court today. I'll go home to review my notes and share them all with you. And so, here's my notepad. This video will not have much of my opinion in it. I'll save that for another video some other time. This is primarily going to be just the facts, okay? So this is my notes from the hearing on September 14th at 10 a.m. in Courtroom 11 at the Mesa County Justice Center. It's the Alexander Kolpakov murder trial. In the room were the judge, the clerk, the bailiff, Alexander Kolpakov, 2 people on defense, 2 people on prosecution. Behind them were Heather's mom and dad. And behind them, when the hearing first started, were 2 police officers. One was about to be called to the stand, and the other one was shadowing that one for the day, so that one was also allowed in. And that's kind of important because the officers were called in one at a time so that they wouldn't be able to see each other's testimony. At exactly 10 a.m., Alexander Kolpakov arrived in the room from the entrance on the side that all of the people in custody come through. The bailiff pulled out his chair for him, and I thought that was pretty nice of him, and then I realized, well, he probably does that for a lot of people that have handcuffs on. Then 5 minutes later, Judge Gurley was tastefully tardy again. He entered, and this entire hearing was about injunctions that the defense wants in place about testimony that will come out during trial. Specifically, unconstitutional search and seizure, where they were lacking evidence for due cause to be searching things. And then at 10:07, the defense requested sequestration, and specifically they wanted that anyone who was in the room could not testify if they were sitting through all of the testimony of everybody else. And while this primarily had to do with the police officers, and the one police officer had to explain that that was his shadow and that the other police officer wasn't going to be testifying, prosecution then turned around and said, and that's the victim's mom, and that's the victim's dad, and they won't be witnesses, and I don't know who that guy is. And then the judge says, does anybody know if this guy is going to be a witness? So I just put my hand up and said, not a witness. But the defense got their motion granted that everyone is sequestered. So if they're going to be a witness later, they can't be sitting through the hearings, and they can't be sitting through other people's testimony. And myself, Heather's mom, and Heather's dad are not allowed to testify at any point in the trial because we've listened to other people's testimony, and we can't testify for any reason. 10:09, Deputy O'Neill takes the stand, and prosecution asks him, what are your general duties as a police officer? And he just goes over like what he was doing that night, responding to emergency calls and whatnot. And then prosecution asked, what did you hear over radio traffic? And Deputy O'Neill said that he heard that other officers had a male suspect at gunpoint. Prosecution asked, "What did you do when you arrived on scene?" And Deputy O'Neill said he participated in clearing the area around the apartments where the shooting happened. Prosecution asked Deputy O'Neill, "What was Deputy Simon doing?" And Deputy O'Neill's response was, "Holding the perimeter." So then the prosecution wanted to know a lot about what Alexander Kolpakov was doing when Deputy O'Neill arrived. And Deputy O'Neill said, Kolpakov was on the ground in handcuffs. They grabbed him and they had to move him into a patrol vehicle. He was physically uncooperative and swinging, is what he said. He also said that Kolpakov mentioned a conspiracy. He was repeatedly saying that he was poisoned, and he was yelling for help. He said that Alexander Kolpakov looked very intoxicated when prosecution asked if he looked intoxicated. And then prosecution asked for Deputy O'Neill to identify Alexander in the room, which he did. The defense had their turn at asking Deputy O'Neill questions. First they asked how many officers were on the scene before Deputy O'Neill, and he said there were 3 deputies who were there before him. He saw Deputy Simon, and Simon was holding the perimeter 15 feet away from Alexander Kolpakov with an AR-15 in hand. And the defense asked how was the weapon oriented, and he said he didn't recall. Defense asked, was Alexander in handcuffs at the time, and he said yes, he was in handcuffs, and he was face down. And he said, did Kolpakov at that point make any noises? And he said he didn't recall. And then defense asked, did he say anything at that point when he was on the ground? And O'Neill said he didn't recall. Then O'Neill said, after that, Kolpakov stood up on his own and started moving towards Deputy Simon. So he grabbed Kolpakov and assisted him to the patrol vehicle. Kolpakov pushed off the vehicle and got taken to the ground, and at that point he was put in a hobble restraint. The defense asked, was he being aggressive? O'Neill said yes. Defense asked, was he being uncooperative? O'Neill said yes. Defense asked, was he not rational? And O'Neill said yes. Defense asked, did he shout for help? O'Neill said yes. Defense asked, did he talk about a conspiracy? O'Neill said yes. Defense asked, did he look clearly under the influence of a substance? And Deputy O'Neill said yes. Then prosecution had their chance to redirect a little bit and asked what were the specific things about his behavior that made them think that he was under the influence of substances. And he said sporadic physical movements and incoherent speech. The judge then had a question himself for Deputy O'Neill, and that was to describe the hobble restraint that was used. And he said that it was a cloth restraint that goes around the legs and complements the handcuffs. Defense then had a couple more questions for Deputy O'Neill. They asked, did Deputy O'Neill perform an impairment test? And he said no. And then defense said the scene was too chaotic for that. And he said yes. And at that point, the witness was excused. (10:23). Deputy Jason Bailey takes the stand. Prosecution asks him for his resume, basically, and he's been an officer since 2016. Prosecution asked him what his duties were. He responded very similarly to O'Neill, to respond to emergency calls, whatnot. And then prosecution asks, let's take you back to May 13th, 2017, close to 10 p.m. What did you hear on the radio? And Deputy Bailey said, I heard a call on the radio from Deputy Holdren. On the radio, Holdren said that there were multiple calls from Lombardy Lane. A male and a female were screaming. The male screamed, I will kill you, and shots were fired. And then prosecution asked where was Holdren when Bailey got there. Bailey said, as I pulled up, Holdren heard 3 more shots, and they met up together. Then Deputy Bailey said the callers met police and pointed out where the shots were fired from. Both Bailey and Holdren drew their weapons on approach, and they were joined by Deputy Simon, who was said to have taken 3 steps out of her car, saw the other 2 had their weapons drawn, and she returned to her car to get the AR-15 rather than draw a 3rd pistol. Deputy Bailey said they all approached and they saw the assailant ducked behind a large bush. Then he came out with his hands up. He had significant blood on his right shoulder on his blue shirt. Deputy Bailey then said that Kolpakov approached and fell to his knees in front of the officers, and Kolpakov was left alone with Deputy Simon, and the other 2 officers went to check the rest of the scene. He said that he found a female laying on her back, feet on the porch, in the doorway, blood all over her torso, eyes shut and unresponsive. And prosecution asked, was there a gun? And Deputy Bailey said that a Glock handgun was laying at her feet, and he described it as out of battery, which means that the Glock was in the back position and stuck there, and that happens either when they jam or when they're out of ammo. And he said that there were shell casings on the ground. And at this point, I actually noticed out of the corner of my eye that Heather Annabelle's mother had a hand fan, one of those compact ones that you can fold out, and it was blue, and she was fanning herself very energetically when the description of her daughter was being said aloud. Deputy Bailey and Deputy Holdren cleared the home. No one else was located. Holdren then told Bailey to put handcuffs on Kolpakov. After that, Deputy Bailey cleared the backyard and a tent that was in the backyard. Prosecution then asked him to identify Alexander Kolpakov in the courtroom, and he did. After that, prosecution asked what he did after he cleared the backyard and the tent, and Bailey said that he came back to where Kolpakov was. He said that Kolpakov had managed to get up off of his belly while in handcuffs, all by himself. And he said that he was checked out by an ambulance, and he began resisting when police tried to search him. And when they tried to take him to the patrol vehicle, that he pushed off the vehicle. He was then sedated by the fire department, which in some places the fire departments and the EMTs are the same thing here in Colorado. Like they get the same training, so they have, Versed in their pockets. So he was sedated by the fire department. He was put on a gurney, and then he was taken to St. Mary's. When prosecution asked, did Kolpakov say anything during this time, he said he kept repeating that he was poisoned. And then he said, "This is a revolution of humanity." Prosecution asked, how long did it take from the time they got on scene to the time that he got transported to the hospital? And Deputy Bailey said it was about 5 minutes from detainment to him being taken to the hospital to St. Mary's. Prosecution asked if Kolpakov was asked any questions, and he said that Kolpakov was not answering any of the questions that the officers asked him. He kept on saying that he was poisoned, help, help, help. And when Officer Holdren asked if there were other shooters, he said, "Who did this to you?" Kolpakov's response was, "I had to put my sweet Heather down." Prosecution had no further questions for him, and the defense got to start asking Officer Bailey questions at 10:35. Defense said, "You linked up with Holdren before getting to the scene, right?" And Bailey said yes. "You approached together, guns drawn, both with pistols?" And he said yes. And he also said that the taxi cab driver that was next to them when they got there said he heard 3 more shots and pointed in the direction that the shots were coming from. Defense asked, was Officer Simon with you before you approached? And he said yes. Simon went back briefly to get her rifle and then rejoined Holdren and Bailey. He said Kolpakov had a blue shirt with blood, and he initially thought that Kolpakov might be a victim. He said Kolpakov had, at first, went behind a bush, and then defense asked, did he come out on command? And Bailey said, I don't recall. When he came out, did you command him? And Bailey said, yes. When we said hands up, he put his hands up. And they commanded him to make no sudden movements. Defense asked, were your guns drawn? And Bailey said yes. Defense asked, did he drop to his knees? And Bailey said yes. Defense asked, did he remain on his knees at that point? Bailey said, I don't recall. Defense asked, was he ordered not to move? And Officer Bailey said, I would imagine so. Defense asked, at that point, did you think that there might still be an active shooter? And Bailey said yes. Defense then asked, was Kolpakov left with Simon with her gun drawn? And Bailey said yes. And then he asked again, did he respond to commands at that point? And Bailey said that he was pretty much silent when he was on the ground. Defense asked, after seeing the female, the decision was made to detain him? And Bailey said yes. Holdren turned and said, cuff him. Defense asked, so he wasn't in the hobble restraints yet? And Bailey said no. Defense asked, was he resisting then? And Bailey said no. And defense asked, and then he got up on his own? And Bailey said yes. By himself? Yes. Defense asked, at that point you were still unsure about the shooter? And Bailey said yes. And then he was asked, did he respond to any questions? And Bailey said the only question he responded to was Holdren's question with the response, I had to put my sweet Heather down. He was saying poisoned over and over and over again. Bailey said, the defense asked, you knew this would be a murder investigation, right? And Bailey said, yes. Was the quote, I had to put my sweet Heather down, in your statement? And Officer Bailey said, no. And the defense asked again, he wasn't hobbled yet? And Officer Bailey said, no. And then Officer Bailey said he began thrashing around when he was being helped to the police car. That's when the hobble restraints were put on him. And at that point, Officer Bailey was excused at 10:51. Then the prosecution called Deputy Hart. She's been a police officer since 2013. She was asked what her normal duties were and what her duties that evening were, and pretty much they were to respond to emergency calls, just like the other two officers. Officer Hart heard a call on the radio from Officer Holdren. At that point, she asked to see her actual report that she wrote of the incident to refresh her memory, and she was given some time to do so. She was asked questions about where the scene was, on Lombardy Lane and whatnot. And then prosecution asked, what did you do? She met up with Deputy Simon, and then Simon and Hart cleared a nearby residence together. And prosecution said, did you find anything? And they said no. And then prosecution said, once that was cleared, you participated in searches, didn't you? And then she said, I don't believe so. I was then maintaining the crime scene. Scene log, sorry. The crime scene log. She had to watch that no one disturbed the body or the firearm. So she took a position where she could see both of those things. And then a voluntary A volunteer police deputy took over the crime scene log and kept track of everybody who came in and out and tried to keep the crime scene intact. And then Officer Hart then joined investigators as a shadow, because she's training to become an investigator. And the investigators had her help take measurements and log the crime scene. And search warrants were obtained for the apartment. Searches were conducted, measurements were conducted, and then the defense got their chance to ask Officer Hart some questions. The defense asked, was the warrant for apartment 3? And she said yes. Then the defense asked, did you find anything during your search of the apartment? And Officer Hart said, we found a bag of mushrooms in the kitchen. And then the defense asked, did you have knowledge of what they're used for? And she said, primarily mushrooms like that are used for a recreational hallucinogen. Officer Hart was then excused at 11:01. The judge asked, does the defense have any witnesses related to any motions today? And the defense said no. The judge then set the next hearing for 1 p.m. on October 5th and said if we need additional time, it will have to be an evening hearing, or perhaps another case might vacate some time. And so the backup date for that is October 12th. The judge asked the defense if they had any arguments that they wanted to present, and the defense was primarily concerned with how the prosecution had stated that they had 3 jail calls that they were going to bring into the trial that they were going to submit for evidence, and the defense was asking that the prosecution has to notify them of which calls will be admitted. And there was some hyperbole that was being used at the time. The defense said that there were thousands of calls, and I don't think that he meant that literally, but they did say that it was completely unfeasible for them to have to listen to all of their clients' calls in order to prepare for this case. They needed to be told which calls that they had to listen to, that the prosecution was going to bring, because the jail has been recording all of his calls, and apparently somebody is taking his collect calls day and night because he's making a lot of them. So the prosecution said that the jail calls are an ongoing thing, and as the prosecution goes, he'll notify the defense of which calls he intends to offer during trial. Prosecution can't say that all the calls have been listened to yet. So not even the prosecution has been able to listen to all the phone calls. Defense said it's not feasible to listen to all the phone calls, and prosecution says we have sent them a log. And the judge was like, but no content to that log, and you didn't tell them which calls that you're going to bring. You just said 3. He said that's not helpful for this trial. The judge said, what is a reasonable deadline for telling the defense which calls you're going to offer for the trial? and prosecution said 35 days prior to the trial would be a good deadline. And the defense agreed. And the judge said that all redactions will be worked out, with the defense making injunction motions by 21 days out, so that both sides would know what's going to be offered in trial. Defense then requested that evidence of prior drug charges and use be discussed in sidebar prior to discussing them openly in the trial for the jury to hear. And prosecution was saying that they do intend to bring up prior drug use, and the judge did agree that if they're going to bring it up, that it's going to be talked in sidebar first to determine relevance, and then talked about in the trial. And then at 11:13, the judge called recess until October 5th at 1 p.m. Like I said, I'm going to keep my opinions out of this video, but I will answer any questions that you have in the comments below, either just by typing, or I'll just put them into my next video where I actually give my opinions. And yeah, give me a day or two to ruminate on this, because there are a couple things in there that stood out to me. So I want to have a good think about them, and yeah, I'll get back to you in a day or two.